I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's for closure, or maybe it's just to untangle the mess in my head. Either way, here I am, pouring it all out. A lot has happened over the past couple of weeks, and it's left me reeling. Let me start from the beginning. It was New Year's Eve, and like every year, I wanted to throw a small party at home. Nothing extravagant, just a few close friends, my wife, and some champagne to ring in the new year. This time, I thought it might be nice to invite our new neighbor, Matthew. He'd moved in barely a week ago, and from what little interaction we'd had, he seemed decent, a reserved, sharp-dressed guy in his mid-40s who had recently gone through a divorce. My wife, Leah, wasn't too keen on the idea. "We barely know him," she said as she set the table. "Exactly," I replied. "What better way to break the ice?" She shrugged but didn't argue further. The evening rolled around, and the house was filled with the soft hum of music and laughter. Matthew arrived right on time, carrying a bottle of wine and an easy smile. He blended in effortlessly, chatting about his recent move and his work in finance. Everyone seemed to like him, maybe a little too much, in Leah's case. At first, I didn't think much of it. She's always been outgoing, good at making people feel welcome. But as the night wore on, I noticed her leaning in when he spoke, laughing at jokes that weren't even funny. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, we'd been married for 10 years, and I'd never doubted her loyalty. Then came the fireworks. We all stepped outside to watch the display in the neighborhood park. I turned to say something to Leah and realized she wasn't beside me. Scanning the crowd, I spotted her near the edge of the yard, talking to Matthew. They were standing close, too close. Her hand was on his arm, and his head was tilted just slightly toward hers, like they were sharing a secret. I told myself it was nothing. I'd invited him here, after all. He was a guest, and she was just being polite. But something about the way they stood there, isolated from the rest of us, gnawed at me. When the countdown began, I decided to let it go. It was New Year's Eve. I didn't want to start the year on a sour note. But as the clock struck midnight and I kissed Leah, her lips felt cold, distracted, even. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the end, and a few days after the party, I couldn't shake the unease I'd felt that night. I told myself I was overthinking. Leah was the same woman I'd loved for a decade. The woman who held my hand when my father passed, who stayed up with me during sleepless nights. Surely, she wouldn't betray me over a random neighbor we barely knew. But small things started standing out. Leah seemed distracted. Normally, we'd spend evenings watching TV or talking about our day. Lately, she'd been retreating to the study, claiming she needed to focus on some work project. It didn't sit right. She wasn't the type to bring work home. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off with a vague, "Deadlines. You know how it is." Then there was her phone. She'd always been open with it, leaving it on the kitchen counter or the nightstand. But now, it was glued to her side. Whenever I walked into a room, she'd lock the screen or turn it face down. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed, I couldn't stop noticing. The real kicker came the following weekend. I'd planned a dinner date, something we hadn't done in months. Leah seemed hesitant when I brought it up, claiming she wasn't feeling well, but eventually, she agreed. We went to our favorite Italian place downtown, and for the first half of the evening, things felt normal. We laughed, reminisced, and even shared dessert like we used to. For a moment, I thought I'd been imagining everything. Maybe she was just stressed from work. But when we got home, she went straight to bed, leaving her purse on the kitchen counter. I don't know what came over me, but as I walked past it, I froze. Her phone was sticking out of the side pocket. I told myself not to look. I wasn't that guy. I respected her privacy. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me walk away. After a minute of internal debate, I gave in and grabbed the phone. It was locked, of course, but a notification lit up the screen. It was a text from Matthew. "Thanks for today. Couldn't have done it without you." My stomach churned. What the hell did that mean? What had she done with him? I couldn't bring myself to read any further, so I put the phone back where I'd found it and sat at the kitchen table, staring into the darkness. Every rational thought told me to talk to her, to clear the air. But the other part of me, the part that had been quietly tallying her recent behavior, was screaming that something was deeply wrong. I went to bed that night, but barely slept. I could feel the space between us in the dark, an invisible wall that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened, smiling as she handed me a cup of coffee. I wanted to confront her right there, to demand answers. But instead, I took the mug, smiled back, and said, "Thanks." I had no idea what I was going to do, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep pretending this was all in my head. After that night, everything changed for me. I began noticing things I'd once ignored or dismissed as coincidence. It wasn't just the text or the way she clung to her phone. It was how she seemed to be pulling away in every aspect of our life. Leah had always been warm and affectionate. We were the kind of couple who still held hands in public, who kissed goodbye every morning. But now, her touch felt absent, hollow. Even her voice carried a detachment that I couldn't unhear. The worst part? I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if she'd always been this way, and I was just now paying attention. Doubt has a funny way of messing with your perception, warping reality until you don't know what's real anymore. One evening, I tried to address it. "Leah," I began, catching her as she was heading upstairs. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, one hand gripping the banister. "What about?" I gestured vaguely, unsure how to phrase what I was feeling without sounding accusatory. "I don't know. Us. You've seemed distant lately." Her face softened, but her expression didn't match the warmth I wanted to see. "I've just been stressed. Work's been insane, and I'm juggling a lot right now." I nodded, though it didn't ease the tension in my chest. "Is that all it is?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I wanted to say it, to mention the text, to demand answers about Matthew. But instead, I shook my head and forced a smile. "Never mind. Forget I said anything?" She nodded slowly and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I spent hours that night staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation in my head. Every word she'd said felt rehearsed, like she'd been expecting me to ask. That thought kept me awake long after she drifted off beside me. The breaking point came a few days later. I'd taken the day off from work to finish some home repairs, a leaky faucet, a door that wouldn't shut properly. Around lunchtime, I decided to grab a bite at a diner a few miles away. As I parked and walked toward the entrance, I froze. Through the glass window, I saw Leah. She was sitting in a booth, her back to me, laughing. Across from her, leaning slightly forward, was Matthew. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I stood there, rooted to the spot. They were so absorbed in their conversation that they didn't notice me. Her laughter rang out, loud and carefree, and he smiled back at her like she was the only person in the world. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to piece together a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be with him. I turned and walked back to my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at nothing, until the ache in my chest became unbearable. When I got home, Leah was already there. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and asked how my day had been, as if nothing had happened. I stared at her, searching her face for any hint of guilt or shame, but she was a perfect picture of calm. "You're home early," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," she replied. "They let us out early for the weekend." "Why?" I forced a smile, my heart pounding. "No reason." Inside, I was screaming. That evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. The image of Leah laughing with Matthew was burned into my mind, and every smile she gave me felt like a cruel lie. I waited until after dinner, when she was cleaning up in the kitchen, to approach her. "Can we talk?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She glanced at me, her hands still submerged in soapy water. "Sure. What's up?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. My stomach twisted as I forced myself to speak. "I saw you today." Her hands paused mid-scrub. She looked over her shoulder at me, her expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" "At the diner," I said, watching her reaction closely. "You and Matthew." For a split second, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Maybe? Guilt? I couldn't tell. She quickly recovered, pulling her hands from the sink and drying them with a towel. "Oh," she said casually. "Yeah, I ran into him while I was out. We grabbed lunch." "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. Leah sighed, leaning back against the counter. "Because I didn't think it was a big deal. It was just lunch, nothing more." "It didn't look like nothing," I said, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "You were laughing like you've known him forever." She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Are you seriously upset about this? You're the one who invited him over for New Year's, remember? I was just being friendly. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But something about the way she spoke, defensive, dismissive, only fueled my doubts. It just doesn't sit right with me," I admitted. "You've been spending time with him, texting him. You're not telling me things, Leah." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you checking my phone now? What is this, some kind of interrogation?" "No," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. "But you're hiding things from me. I feel it." She scoffed, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. He's our neighbor. Am I supposed to ignore him just because you're feeling insecure?" "Insecure?" I repeated, my voice rising. "This isn't about insecurity. It's about trust. I saw how you looked at him, Leah. That's not how you look at a neighbor." Her cheeks flushed with anger. "You're being paranoid," she snapped. "I can't believe you're blowing this out of proportion." I took a step closer, trying to keep my composure. "Then tell me the truth," I said quietly. "If there's nothing going on, just say it." She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Her eyes flickered downward before meeting mine again, and her voice softened. "Nothing is going on," she said firmly. "I promise." But I didn't believe her. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, and walked out of the kitchen. My mind was spinning as I headed upstairs, replaying every moment of the conversation. That hesitation, that defensive tone. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it confirmed what my gut had been screaming all along. I knew what I had to do. Later that night, while Leah was asleep, I crept downstairs and retrieved her phone from her purse. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. Yes, I knew the password. I hated myself for crossing this line, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. The first thing I checked was her text history with Matthew. Most of their messages seemed harmless, brief exchanges about neighborhood stuff, random jokes, but as I scrolled further, my chest tightened. "Matthew, you looked amazing today." "Leah, stop, ha. You're too sweet." "Matthew, wish we had more time to talk. Feels like we're always sneaking moments." "Leah, I know. It's hard." "Matthew, maybe next week? Just us?" "Leah, I'll see what I can do." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring as the words sank in. They weren't explicit, but the tone, the intimacy, was undeniable. I couldn't breathe. My worst fears were coming true, and the evidence was right there in front of me. My hands clenched into fists as I locked the phone and returned it to her purse. I stood there in the dark, trembling with a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something was happening between them, and Leah had lied to my face about it. As I climbed back into bed, I glanced at her sleeping form, her face peaceful and untroubled. How could she betray me like this? How could she look me in the eye and deny it? I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't know if I wanted the answers to. But one thing was clear. The truth wouldn't stay hidden for long. The morning after I went through Leah's phone, I couldn't look at her the same way. Every smile, every casual word she spoke felt like a lie. It was as if the ground beneath our marriage was crumbling, and she didn't even notice. I told myself I needed more proof before confronting her again. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe those texts were innocent, or at least not as damning as they seemed. But deep down, I knew better. That evening, I came up with a plan. "Hey, Leah," I said as she curled up on the couch with her tablet. "I was thinking we should have Matthew over for dinner again. You know, as a thank you for being so friendly since he moved in." Her head snapped up, and for a fleeting moment, I caught something in her eyes. Surprise? Fear? It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Oh, sure," she said lightly, though her tone was too casual. That sounds nice. When? Tomorrow, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. I'll grill something. Tomorrow? Isn't that a bit last minute? She asked, frowning slightly. I shrugged. I'm sure he'll be free. He's new in town. Probably doesn't have a lot of plans yet. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay, I'll let him know. The next day, I spent the morning preparing for dinner, marinating steaks, setting the table, and pretending everything was normal. Leah seemed on edge, flitting around the house as if she couldn't sit still. She kept checking her phone, texting more than usual, though she tried to hide it. By the time Matthew arrived, I was ready, or as ready as I could be. He showed up with another bottle of wine, flashing his polished smile as Leah greeted him at the door. Thanks for inviting me, he said, stepping inside. Smells amazing in here. No problem, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Maybe a little too firmly. Glad you could make it. We sat down to dinner, and for the first hour, everything seemed normal. Leah was her usual charming self, laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. Matthew played along, engaging us both in easy conversation about his move, his work, and his plans for the new year. But I was watching, observing, and the more I paid attention, the more I noticed the subtle things. The way his gaze lingered on Leah just a second too long, the way she seemed to mirror his movements without realizing it. They were careful, but not careful enough. At one point, I excused myself to grab something from the kitchen. When I returned, I caught them exchanging a look, brief but unmistakable. It was the kind of look you don't share with a neighbor. I felt my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront them, not yet, not without more leverage. After dinner, Matthew offered to help clean up, but I waved him off. Don't worry about it, I said with a tight smile. You're our guest. He nodded, glancing at Leah as he grabbed his coat. Thanks again for having me over. It was great. Anytime, I replied, my voice neutral. Leah walked him to the door, and I stayed in the dining room, listening as they exchanged polite goodbyes. But then, just as he was about to leave, I heard her lower her voice. We'll talk later, she murmured. I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My suspicions were no longer just suspicions. They were facts, clear as day. When Leah came back, she acted like nothing had happened. Well, that was nice, she said, picking up a dish from the table. He's really settling in, don't you think? I didn't respond. I just nodded, watching her carefully. Every word she said only added fuel to the fire burning inside me. Later that night, when she fell asleep, I went to work. I installed a small recording device in the living room, hidden behind a decorative vase on the shelf. If they were going to slip up, I wanted evidence. Real evidence. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not after what I'd seen. Whatever was happening between Leah and Matthew, it wasn't going to stay in the shadows for long. The next few days were a test of patience and willpower. Every time Leah picked up her phone, every time she left the house for errands or a walk, I felt a knot tightening in my chest. But I played my role perfectly, calm, unsuspecting, normal. If she noticed anything different about me, she didn't show it. I spent hours replaying the dinner in my head, analyzing every glance, every word exchanged between her and Matthew. I wasn't proud of the lengths I was going to, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. 3 days after I planted the recording device, I got my first lead. It was late in the evening, and Leah was upstairs taking a shower. I used the opportunity to retrieve the device and listen to the recordings. Most of it was mundane. Background noise, the hum of the television, Leah talking to herself while folding laundry. But then I hit a jackpot. I recognized Matthew's voice immediately. It was faint, but I could make out the conversation. Matthew, you shouldn't be worried. He doesn't suspect a thing. Leah, I don't know. He's been asking questions lately. Matthew, then just keep playing it cool. This can't go on forever, you know? My chest tightened as I listened, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Leah, I know. I don't know how to end it. He doesn't deserve this. Matthew, you deserve to be happy, Leah. Don't forget that. The conversation ended there, and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of their words pressing down on me. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Not from each other, at least. For a moment, I felt paralyzed. My mind raced with questions, but one thought drowned out all the others. She's choosing him. I put the device back in its hiding spot and tried to act normal when Leah came downstairs. She kissed my cheek and curled up on the couch beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was too busy churning through everything I'd heard, every detail I'd missed. The texts, the diner, the recording. It was all coming together, forming a picture I could no longer deny. The next day, I decided to confront Matthew. If Leah wouldn't give me the truth, I'd get it from him. That evening, I knocked on his door. He opened it quickly, his face lighting up with a smile that vanished the moment he saw me. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "What's up?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He shut the door behind me, and I turned to face him, my arms crossed. "I know what's going on between you and Leah." His eyes widened for a split second before he recovered, trying to play it cool. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I've seen the texts. I've heard the recordings." "I know." He looked away, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think," he said weakly. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, my voice rising. "Explain to me why my wife is sneaking around with you, why she's lying to my face while you tell her she deserves to be happy." He didn't answer. His silence said more than words ever could. "Do you love her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, his expression conflicted. "I don't know," he admitted, "but she's unhappy. She told me." "She told you what?" I interrupted. "That I'm some monster? That our marriage is falling apart? Is that how you justified this?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Save it. I don't care what excuses you have. I'm giving you one chance to walk away, right now. Leave her alone, or I promise you'll regret it." For a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I never wanted this to happen," he said quietly. "Then fix it," I said, my voice cold. "Because if you don't, I will." When I got home that night, Leah was already in bed. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and it broke my heart to think of the lies she'd told, the betrayal she'd hidden. I didn't know how this was going to end, but one thing was certain. The facade was crumbling, and it wouldn't be long before everything came crashing down. The morning after my confrontation with Matthew, I woke up feeling like I was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Leah was already downstairs, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. It was such a normal scene, so heartbreakingly ordinary, that for a moment, I wondered if I was the crazy one. But then I remembered the texts, the recordings, the lies. No, I wasn't crazy. I was a man being betrayed in his own home. As we sat across from each other at the table, I couldn't help but study her. She looked calm, content even, as she sipped her coffee and glanced at her phone. I wondered if she was texting him right now, making plans while I sat there like a fool. "So," I said, forcing casualness into my voice, "what's your day looking like?" She glanced up, startled by the question. "Just the usual," she said with a shrug. "I might run a few errands later." "Why?" "No reason," I replied, taking a bite of toast. "Just curious." She nodded and went back to her phone, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lay everything out in the open. But I held back. Not yet. That afternoon, I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad spy movie, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. Around 2 p.m., she grabbed her purse and announced she was heading out. "Won't be long," she said, kissing my cheek. The gesture made my skin crawl. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. She drove into town, her car weaving through familiar streets before pulling into a small cafe. I parked a few spots away, my heart pounding as I watched her get out. She wasn't alone for long. A few minutes later, Matthew arrived. He parked on the opposite side of the lot, and they met near the entrance, exchanging a quick, nervous glance before stepping inside together. I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This was it. There was no denying it anymore. They were meeting in secret, right under my nose. I wanted to march into the cafe and confront them right then and there. But something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or a twisted sense of pride. Instead, I sat in the car, staring at the entrance, waiting for them to come out. When they finally did, they were smiling, laughing. She looked happier than I'd seen her in months, and it killed me to think that her joy wasn't because of me. As they parted ways, him heading to his car, her heading to hers, I made my decision. This wasn't going to be a quiet confrontation or a private discussion. No, this was war. That evening, I started gathering evidence. I retrieved the recordings, saved screenshots of the texts, and even wrote down the details of their meeting at the cafe. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it all, but I knew I needed to be ready. Leah came home later than usual, claiming she'd gotten caught up running errands. I nodded, pretending to believe her, while inside, I was seething. I waited until she went to bed before pulling out my laptop and drafting an email to Matthew. It was short and to the point. Matthew, I gave you a chance to walk away, and you didn't take it. You've left me no choice but to act. If you think I'm bluffing, just wait. You'll see what happens when you cross the wrong person. Him. I hit send and stared at the screen, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Leah, the web of lies she'd spun was about to collapse. And for Matthew, the smooth-talking neighbor who thought he could steal another man's wife, the reckoning was coming. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The email I sent to Matthew wasn't just a warning. It was the opening shot in a battle I'd been forced to fight. I wasn't going to sit back and let them walk all over me. If Leah wanted him so badly, they could have each other. But not before they paid for what they'd done. The next morning, Leah acted like everything was normal. She was chatting about a work project over breakfast, her tone light and casual. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I was already planning my next move. After she left for work, I went through her things. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but at this point, all bets were off. I found nothing incriminating in her purse or her work bag, but when I opened her laptop, I struck gold. There it was, an email chain between her and Matthew. Most of it was the same flirtatious nonsense I'd seen in her texts, but one message caught my attention. Matthew, I've been thinking about what you said. Are you sure this is the right time? Leah, it has to be. He's been suspicious lately, and I don't want him finding out before I've figured everything out. We'll talk more tomorrow. Suspicious. That was the word she used to describe me. I clenched my jaw, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. She was planning something, and whatever it was, it didn't bode well for me. I copied the entire email chain and sent it to myself. The more evidence I had, the better. Later that day, I paid a visit to a lawyer. I'd never thought I'd need one. I'd always believed Leah and I would grow old together, that we'd weather any storm life threw at us. But as I sat in the lawyer's office, laying out the situation, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was the beginning of the end, and I was ready for it. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, listened intently as I explained everything. She didn't interrupt, letting me vent my frustrations and outline the betrayal in painstaking detail. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. You've got a strong case, she said. The emails, the recordings, the texts, they all point to infidelity. If it comes to divorce, this will work in your favor. Good, I said, my voice flat. I don't want her walking away with anything she doesn't deserve. Carla nodded. That's fair. But I'll be honest with you. These things can get messy. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared for anything, I replied. She made her choice. Now she has to live with it. Carla gave me a small, approving smile. All right, let's get to work. That evening, Leah came home in high spirits. She kissed me on the cheek and told me she'd had a great day, then went upstairs to change. I watched her go, a hollow feeling settling in my chest. How could she act so normal, knowing what she was doing behind my back? When she came back downstairs, I forced myself to smile and suggested we watch a movie. She seemed surprised but agreed, curling up on the couch beside me. For a moment, it felt almost like old times. Almost. But the facade didn't last. I couldn't stop thinking about her emails, about the way she'd laughed with Matthew at the cafe. Every time she glanced at her phone, my stomach twisted. By the time she fell asleep, I'd made up my mind. This charade had gone on long enough. It was time to put my plan into motion. The next morning, while Leah was at work, I started making phone calls. First to Carla, to finalize the divorce papers. Then to a locksmith, to have the locks on the house changed. And finally, to Matthew's wife. Her name was Rachel. I'd found her contact information through a bit of online sleuthing, and when she answered the phone, her voice was cautious. Hello? Rachel, my name is Mark. I think we need to talk about your husband. There was a pause, then, what about him? I took a deep breath. He's been having an affair. With my wife. The line went silent for a moment before she spoke again, her voice shaking. Are you sure? I have proof, I said. Emails, texts, recordings. I can send them to you if you'd like. Please do, she said, her tone cold and measured. I'll be waiting. That night, as I lay in bed beside Leah, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, the truth would come crashing down on both of them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after my call to Rachel, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in uncertainty. The plan was in motion, and I was finally regaining control of my life. Leah seemed oblivious as she moved around the kitchen, humming to herself while she made coffee. I couldn't decide if her nonchalance infuriated me or broke my heart. How could she act like this, knowing what she'd done? Anything special planned for today? She asked, handing me a mug. Not really, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Just some errands. She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. I might head into town later, pick up a few things. I felt a pang of suspicion but forced myself to smile. Sounds good. As soon as she left the house, I got to work. My first task was sending the evidence to Rachel. I compiled everything, the emails, the texts, the recordings, and attached them to an email with a short message. Rachel, I'm sorry you have to see this, but you deserve to know the truth. Your husband and my wife have been seeing each other behind our backs. I thought you should know before they hurt anyone else. Mark. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A part of me felt guilty for dragging Rachel into this, but I knew it was the right thing to do. She deserved the truth as much as I did. That afternoon, I heard back from her. Her reply was short but furious. Mark, thank you for sending this. I can't believe he's done this to me, to us. I don't even know what to say right now, but rest assured, I'll be dealing with him. Rachel. Her anger was palpable, even through the screen. I could picture the confrontation unfolding in her home, Matthew's excuses falling flat as she threw the truth in his face. The thought gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. Later that evening, Leah came home earlier than usual. She seemed tense, her smile forced as she kissed me on the cheek. Long day, she murmured, heading straight for the shower. I watched her go, my mind racing. Did she know? Had Matthew warned her about what I'd done? I doubted it. Rachel didn't strike me as the type to share her plans with him. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The next day, the storm broke. It was just after lunch when Rachel called me. Her voice was tight with anger. Mark, I thought you should know. Matthew's trying to run damage control. He told me everything, including how your wife begged him to keep quiet. My stomach turned. What do you mean? He said she was terrified of you finding out, Rachel said. She thought if she could keep it a secret long enough, you'd let your suspicions go. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the phone. And what did you say to him? I told him to pack his things, she replied, her voice sharp. And I made it clear he wouldn't be seeing our kids until this mess was sorted out. Good, I said, feeling a spark of vindication. He deserves that. So does your wife, Rachel added, her tone softening. I'm sorry you're going through this, Mark. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Thank you, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat, but I think I've got it under control. That evening, I decided it was time to confront Leah. When she came home, I was waiting for her in the living room, the evidence spread out on the coffee table. She froze in the doorway, her eyes darting between me and the damning pile of emails and texts. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling. "What is this?" "You tell me," I said coldly, "because it sure looks like proof of you cheating on me." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. "You went through my things? You gave me no choice," I snapped. "I trusted you, Leah. I believed in us. And this is how you repay me?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "Don't bother lying. I've already spoken to Matthew's wife. She knows everything." At that, Leah's composure cracked. Her shoulders slumped, and tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted it to go this far." "Then why did you?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" She shook her head, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know," she said softly. "I was unhappy. I felt lost." "Lost?" I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "So you found yourself in another man's arms?" Her silence was answer enough. I stood, my chest heaving with anger and betrayal. "Pack your things, Leah. I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. "Mark, please." "No," I said firmly. "We're done." As I walked out of the room, her sobs echoed behind me, but I didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. This wasn't over, not yet, but the end was finally in sight. The morning after I confronted Leah, the house was eerily silent. I hadn't slept much, my thoughts racing between anger and a hollow sense of loss. The woman I had built my life with, the one I trusted above all else, was gone. Not physically yet, but emotionally and morally. When Leah came downstairs, she looked like she'd aged overnight. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't try to speak to me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I didn't bother speaking to her, either. By noon, she had packed her things. Suitcases lined the hallway, and she stood by the door with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to say something, but when I didn't, she walked out, closing the door softly behind her. After Leah left, the house felt suffocatingly empty. Every corner held memories of her. The way she rearranged the bookshelves, the scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom, the coffee mug she always used still sitting on the counter. I spent the next few days cleaning, trying to erase the traces of her. It didn't help. The silence was deafening, and no matter how hard I scrubbed or how many things I threw out, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. Rachel called me a few times during those days. She told me Matthew had left as well, but not without a fight. "He begged me to take him back," she said bitterly. "Can you believe that?" We talked for hours, finding solace in each other's shared pain. It was strange. This woman I'd never met had become my lifeline. Together, we pieced through the wreckage, trying to make sense of it all. It didn't take long for the news to spread. In a small community like ours, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Neighbors whispered behind their hands when they saw me, their pity evident in their forced smiles. Leah had moved in with a friend across town, but that didn't stop the rumors. People speculated about the affair, about whether it had been going on longer than anyone knew. I tried to ignore it, but every whispered conversation felt like another dagger in my chest. Eventually, I stopped going out altogether. One day, Rachel suggested we meet in person. She said she needed closure, and honestly, so did I. We met at a quiet coffee shop outside town, far enough away that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. She looked just as exhausted as I felt, but her eyes held a determination I hadn't expected. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, "what now?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Try to move on, I guess." Rachel nodded. "It's not going to be easy." "No," I agreed. "But I'm done letting this define me." We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing. By the time we left, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Leah reached out to me about a month later. She wanted to meet, to talk things over. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at the same diner where I'd first seen her with Matthew. It felt poetic in a way. She looked nervous as she sat across from me, her hands fidgeting with the napkin in her lap. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began. "For everything." "I've heard that before," I said flatly. "What do you want, Leah?" Her face crumpled. "I want to make things right." I shook my head, leaning back in my seat. "You can't, Leah. You made your choice. You chose him." "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "Please, Mark, I don't want to lose you." "You already have," I said, standing up. "Goodbye, Leah." As I walked out of the diner, I felt a sense of finality settle over me. The chapter was closed. For good this time that it's been 6 months since I found out about the affair. The divorce is final, the house is mine, and I've started to rebuild my life. Rachel and I still talk occasionally, though we've both made it clear that we're not looking for anything more than friendship. For now, that's enough. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about Leah, wondering where she is, if she's happy. But those moments are fleeting. The pain is still there, but it's dulled with time. This experience has taught me a lot about myself, about love, and about what I'm willing to accept. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, there's no piecing it back together. But life doesn't end when someone betrays you. It changes, it shifts, but it keeps going. And so do I.